There are many examples of where attackers have successfully compromised networks and done serious damage to the organization. I want to talk about just two, and I've picked two that demonstrate a really comprehensive attack that's managed to compromise many different assets within the target organization. Assets that would inevitably have been segmented, very often firewalled, very often had defenses such as an IDS or honeypots as well. Yet these attacks were successful. Let's go and have a look at what I mean. On the 24th of November 2014, employees of Sony Pictures arrived at work and saw this on their screens. The network had been infested by malware. And as you can see from the imagery here, there was no mistaking the malice that was involved in this attack. The messages that everyone saw on their screen had a combination of threats and links to proof of the data that the attackers had allegedly exfiltrated from Sony's network. It was a huge incident. It attracted enormous amounts of media attention, in part because of the damage it did to Sony Pictures alone, and also in part due to the speculation that ensued about who the actual perpetrators of the attack were. And one of the first things we learned about it was that it was allegedly orchestrated by the Guardians of Peace, or GOP. Now, of course, it's always hard to tell who is actually behind one of these attacks, but that was the first indicator we had of attribution. Now, GOP claimed to have had access to Sony Pictures systems for the last year. That's a huge amount of time to remain persistent in a network, and obviously over that duration a huge amount of damage could be done. What GOP ultimately did is leaked 40 gigabytes worth of the organization's data publicly. So that's 40 gigabytes which was distributed out over the internet, and anyone with a curiosity could easily obtain it. However, as large as 40 gigabytes is, the attackers claim to have grabbed more than 100 terabytes. And if they did indeed have access to the network for a year, you can imagine how they might have been able to come across such a large amount of data. But as you're reading this as well, have a think about what would have been involved in gathering that much information. Even 40 gigabytes would have meant the adversary accessing quite a large number of files and resources on the internal network and likely exfiltrating them back out through their internet connection. So think about the sort of fingerprints and trails an attack like this would have left. Now, as well as all the data they took, they also managed to hijack the Twitter account of Sony Pictures, and within that data which then hit the internet, we also saw things like unreleased films. Now, something like a film, an unreleased film at that, is obviously very important intellectual property for a picture-making company. But the attackers went even further. They managed to obtain other assets such as employee credentials, RSA Secure ID tokens, so a second factor of authentication for accessing resources such as VPNs, and a number of the organization's digital certificates, all made public. But as if that wasn't bad enough, there are also 170,000 emails exposed publicly. Now have a think about the different classes of information here, and this is why I wanted to show this example of a compromise right up the start of the course. Being able to take over an organization's Twitter account would have involved having the credentials for Twitter, which is a very different class of asset to something like unreleased films, which is a very different class of asset again to things like Secure ID tokens and certificates. And further to that, the emails. And many of those emails were very sensitive emails that caused a great deal of embarrassment when they were leaked. That's a very different class of asset again. So as you read through the information in front of you here, you can start to build a bit of a mental picture of just how comprehensive the access must have been to Sony Pictures' network. Within that environment, there were certainly many firewalls, almost certainly intrusion detection systems, and very likely honeypots as well. Yet somehow, the attackers managed to evade them all such that they could gain access to this data. The very fact the attack began with malware must have meant they were able to circumvent antivirus, It may have simply begun on an individual's PC. That could have been the starting point. And the AV running in that single environment might have kicked off everything else that you see here. That was a very comprehensive attack. Let's move on and look at one other one, and that's Ashley Madison. Ashley Madison was hacked in July 2015. The attackers claimed to have gained access to the environment, and they posted a small amount of proof to demonstrate that they did indeed have some internal sensitive information. They threatened Avid Life Media, the owners of Ashley Madison, that they'd release all the data unless the service shut down. And of course the service didn't shut down, it continued to run, and in August 2015, a huge amount of very sensitive, very personal information was dumped publicly. Let's have a look at just how bad the Ashley Madison attack really was. One of the first things we knew about this attack was that it was orchestrated by a group calling themselves the Impact Team. To this date, 9 months on from the original attack, we still don't know who the Impact Team actually was. And as far as we know, the perpetrators have gotten away with it, at least so far. So, what did they actually do? Well, first of all, more than 25 gigabytes worth of data was publicly released. Now, this data was distributed in a fashion to ensure that it spread as fast and easily as possible. It was torrented very extensively. And anyone with a curiosity in the Ashley Madison data could easily download the content. And many people were curious. Ashley Madison is a site built expressly for adultery. It's a very salacious topic. Lots of people, lots of media outlets wanted to get their hands on the data and see what was inside. Or more specifically, who was inside. And what they found was over 30 million individuals. And of course, a presence on an adultery site is going to be very sensitive personal information. The mere presence of someone alone is sensitive, let alone some of the personal preferences that were also captured on the site. But the thing about Ashley Madison, like Sony Pictures, is that the compromise went so much further than just one system. So for example, the entire code base was also released. So all of the code that drove that Ashley Madison website was torrented along with the entire database of users. Now they're related assets, but they are quite different. We'll often see membership databases leaked online due to an attack such as SQL injection, which wouldn't have had access to the actual code base of the site. Yet this attack had both. Not only that, but it also resulted in nearly 13 gigabytes worth of corporate email being released. And a significant portion of that was the CEOs as well. So very high level, very sensitive communications. This ultimately led to the CEO standing down as well. It obviously had a severe impact on the leadership structure of Ashley Madison. Both this and Sony Pictures were really significant attacks, and they're relevant to this course in many of the same ways. Let me explain. There are three main reasons I've included these two examples in the course. Number one, obviously they were hugely damaging. Events like that cost the organisations huge amounts of money, not just in the effort of actually containing the attack or all the forensics that go on after an event like this, but in so many other ways as well. Loss of reputation, loss of revenue, the class actions that were mounted as a result. Attacks of this scale have a very, very long tail. The impact of it goes on for many years afterwards. But the other thing that was so significant about both of these is just the breadth of very independent assets within the organisations that were compromised. Code bases, emails, unreleased films and Twitter accounts. These are very, very discrete units. Yet somehow the attackers managed to gain access to all of them. And that ultimately brings us to the third point, in that the only way this could have happened is that they had to evade a whole bunch of different security controls. These attacks were successful because they managed to overcome multiple different independent defenses. So these two examples were important to set the scene as to just how comprehensive these attacks can be, and how the one perpetrator can identify and overcome all sorts of different security controls within an organisation. So they're our industry precedents. Let's now move on and talk a bit about the role of IDS, firewalls, and honeypots within an organisation's defences. There's no one single way of configuring a network using these defences. So let's talk about just one simple example of where these might fit into the organisational defences, and then as we progress through the course, we'll look at some very discrete architectures of how they're used. So let's start with a client, and that client is connecting through a firewall. And a firewall is very often the first line of defense. It's a pretty basic utilitarian sort of device. We'll talk more about that in the next module. The firewall may then pass traffic through an intrusion detection system. And the IDS is going to start to look for traffic patterns it doesn't trust. As with firewalls, there are many different levels of IDS and different behaviours that they'll look for. Some of them these days do get quite intelligent in terms of establishing what sort of traffic it believes is trustworthy and what it believes might be suspicious. Inevitably, if traffic is deemed good, it may well then end up within an internal network. And inevitably, traffic may be routed to a web server and then onwards to a database server or into other assets within that target environment. Now, that target environment may also have a honeypot, or a very specific device that sits there as a bit of a beacon to attackers, inviting them to probe away, see what they find. And if malicious activity is detected, it then alerts an administrator, hey, someone is in the network accessing something that they shouldn't be. Certainly, honeypots are a lot less common than firewalls and even an IDS, but they actually play a pretty valuable role, and we'll look at that towards the end of the course. Now, as I said, this is just one architecture. It's not always outbound requests coming into a private network that have these protections. Very often, internal traffic within a corporate environment will go through multiple levels of firewall. Very often, honeypots will sit on an external network, publicly facing the internet. This is but one configuration, and it shows you where they might fit within the environment and the different roles they play. This is also the order we're going to go through the course. We're going to look at firewalls first, in part because that is one of the most common defenses, and also because it's very frequently the first defense that an attacker will hit when they're probing into a network. We'll then move on and look at those intrusion detection systems and wrap up the course on honeypots. Before we move on to those though, I want to have a look at just a few other things in this introductory module. And the next one is indicators of file system intrusion. Let's start to think about some of the indicators that may be present when an attacker is in an organization's file system. So think back to those examples I gave earlier on in the module, Sony Pictures and Ashley Madison. Clearly, there are attackers in that network pulling out large amounts of data. One of the questions you might ask is whether or not there's some unfamiliar programs that have been introduced to the environment. The Sony Pictures attack allegedly began with malware. That would be an unfamiliar program. And if that could have been picked up really early on in the life cycle of that attack, things might have turned out quite differently. Another indicator is escalation of privilege. And certainly this is one of the things that attackers like to do very early on. Can they connect to a system with a non-privileged account and then escalate the rights such that they can access resources that they shouldn't be able to? Often that will involve exploiting risks in specific frameworks, but the end result is the same. Have privileges on a particular role or a user changed unexpectedly? File permissions is another one. If there was a sudden and unexpected change in file permissions, such that someone who probably shouldn't have access to them now does, could that be an indicator of a file system intrusion? Particularly when we think about the classes of asset that were exfiltrated from those two examples we looked at earlier on. One of the ways that may well have happened is if resources that were tightly locked down had their permissions changed such that they were more broadly accessible. And finally, changes in file size could also indicate a problem, particularly in this era of ransomware, where files are strongly encrypted by malicious software and then the victim is charged in order to obtain the private key to unlock them. If you started seeing unexpected file size changes en masse, that could be a very early indicator of an attack such as that. So these are just 4 really straightforward examples of potential indicators that there's been an intrusion. Now, they're not necessarily easy. It'd be easy to miss many of these indicators, and it would also be easy to have many false positives. But again, when you think back to those 2 examples earlier on, and you compare them against this, inevitably there would have been indicators of the intrusion. And it's just a question of whether the organization is equipped to identify those. Let's move on and have a look at another set of indicators. And that's indicators of network intrusion. When we talk about indicators at the network level, we're talking about things like volumes of traffic. So is there sudden and unexplained exfiltration of data? So for example, if the Sony Pictures attackers genuinely did exfiltrate 100 terabytes worth of data and take that out via their network connection, that's the sort of behavior you really want to be able to identify. Now, it's not just the volume of traffic moving through a network. There's also the question of what sorts of ports and protocols is it using. So are we seeing a sudden influx in traffic moving over, say, FTP? That might be an unusual pattern for an organization. It might also be an indicator of malicious software sending traffic out and dumping it on the attacker's FTP server. As we're going through these bullet points, you should be starting to think, what is normal versus what is anomalous? We'll talk more about that as we get to the end of this module, but just keep that in mind as we look at these bullet points. A good example of that is failed logins. We expect people to fail at logins every now and then, but if there was a sudden influx of failures against one or many accounts, could that be a possible indicator of a network intrusion? Of course, it makes sense because this is what attackers like to do. They like to try and brute force accounts. If you saw that sort of behavior in a network, how well equipped are you to actually identify it? And finally, connections from unusual IP addresses. And this again goes back to the point about normal versus abnormal behavior. Are you clear enough about what normal traffic patterns look like within a network, such that when there is anomalous behavior, it's flagged and you can pick it up early? And you'll note as you look through the words on the screen here, and on the previous screen about file system intrusion, the same words keep appearing. Unusual, unexplained, unfamiliar. And these are really the key to being able to identify these sorts of behavior. And certainly they're exactly the sorts of things that IDS, firewalls and honeypots are there to both prevent and detect. Let's go on and look at one more thing in this module, and that's to better define anomalous behavior. Much of what we're going to look at in this course comes down to this. What is normal and trustworthy versus what is unusual and suspicious? And really this is the role that these devices play, to try and categorize traffic into what we believe is good versus what we suspect might be bad. We just looked at a bunch of different examples of both of these in indicators of file system intrusion and of course indicators of network intrusion as well. We'll take a look at various ways we can define these two categories, either by being clear about what we trust or by defining what we know to be bad. But of course, a very important part of this course is about evading these controls as well, which is going to lead us to ask this question. How can unusual and suspicious traffic be disguised as normal and trustworthy traffic? How can we evade IDS, firewalls, and honeypots? We're going to spend a lot of time looking at how these 3 classes of defense work. And then of course we are going to spend some time on looking at those evasion techniques as well. And by the end of it, you'll have a much better appreciation of how an attack like Sony Pictures or Ashley Madison could have occurred in the first place. So that's the first module. Let's now move on and have a quick look at the summary before we continue on to firewalls. Let's summarize the module. And one of the first things we looked at was the Sony Pictures and the Ashley Madison attacks. And in both of those examples, I made the point that there would have been multiple defenses evaded. They were just so comprehensive. They accessed so many different classes of resource that inevitably the attackers were very adept at evading all sorts of security measures. Typically within networks, we'll see a combination of these defenses: IDSs, firewalls, and honeypots. And they do all play different roles. They have different strengths and indeed different weaknesses as well. One of the key things in detecting and then of course defending against an attack is understanding what anomalous behavior looks like. And we talked about how that could be identified at both the file system and the network level. And again, it comes back to this point about defense in depth. How can we apply multiple defenses, looking at multiple aspects of the systems within an organization to best try and defend against these attacks? Let's now move on and start looking at that network level. Let's go and look at firewalls. Frequently within technology, we see names that are derived from things in the physical world, things that existed before the technology itself did. And such is the case with firewalls, which we've had around for a very long time in construction. In fact, if you look at most buildings today, you'll notice that there are firewalls built into the building. Not digital firewalls that are designed to segment systems, but firewalls built out of material such as concrete, masonry blocks, constructions that are designed to literally stop fire from spreading from one part of a building to another. And it's really a digital equivalent of this that we're now talking about when we look at firewalls within networks. So devices that are meant to segment two logical units. In the picture here, those logical units may be different rooms in an apartment building. In the network, those logical units could be different subnets. Same principle. There's another place though that we see firewalls outside of information systems, and you probably have one of these yourself. This is under the bonnet of my car. There is a firewall between the engine bay and the cabin. And there are very strict automotive guidelines on how those firewalls need to be constructed and the sorts of things that they should protect the occupant against. So obviously they are fire-resistant materials. They also have to meet standards for crashworthiness. Yet, like digital firewalls, they also need to provide the facility for information to travel from one side to the other. So for example, the steering column goes through the firewall. I need to be able to put inputs into the steering wheel and have it travel down the steering column and eventually turn the front wheels of the vehicle. There are a number of conduits for electronic communication. The controls that I use in the cabin need to affect various units under the bonnet, things like the air conditioning and the heating system. And again, this is still a firewall. It's just not a digital firewall and it's not segmenting information systems. But hopefully this and the construction example I just gave you set some context as to where this term has come from and why we still use it today, because philosophically they're very similar concepts. Having said that, let's move on and look at firewalls in the context that's relevant to this course. Let's start by defining digital firewalls. There are a couple of important points in this definition, and one of them is the control of incoming and outgoing network traffic. And I touched on that a little bit earlier in this module. Firewalls generally tend to control the bi-directional flow of traffic. So think about a firewall in front of an organization, separating it from the public internet. It needs to be able to block incoming traffic to try and keep attackers out, but it also needs to be able to allow outgoing traffic because people need to browse the web, send emails, have communication that exits the network. The second point here around establishing a barrier is also interesting. We just looked at two examples of that where it is literally physically a barrier in construction and in automotive. And of course, the same thing is true when we have digital firewalls protecting our systems. Now, in many cases, that is exactly what's said here, a barrier between a trusted network and another outside network. But we'll also see many variations of that as well. So for example, the firewall that may be running on your PC. Let's go and have a look at a few different types of firewall implementation. We use this term firewall a lot, but it can mean very different implementations of the concept. And what we're looking at here is probably one of the most basic implementations of a firewall that you'll find, the Windows firewall that's built into modern versions of the operating system. This is a pretty straightforward firewall. It's going to define the classes of inbound traffic that are allowed and the classes of outbound traffic. Now, this is a host-based firewall. It is just running on my machine. Now, my machine sits inside my own personal trusted network, yet I still have a firewall between my machine and every other machine on it. So one of the points I want to make here is that often you'll have multiple different classes of firewall at different points within a network environment. Now, obviously this is just a little home network, but the same is true of organizational networks. One thing that is quite different between a personal solution like this and a corporate environment is that in the enterprise, you'll see equipment like this. This is a Barracuda firewall. It is a physical rack-mounted device. And this class of device is designed to do the sorts of network segmentation that we saw in that previous definition. It's meant to sit between public network segments and private network segments. And it is a serious piece of gear. Now, having said that, we do also see hardware firewalls built into devices like home routers, except clearly they're meant for a very different class of use. But the premise of having a firewall that is merely a software product versus having a firewall which is a dedicated piece of infrastructure is the same. And certainly many of the things that these two different classes of firewall do are also very similar. So for example, most of them do simple packet filtering. That's one of the first types of firewall that we're going to look at in just a moment. But before that, I want to touch on one more firewall type. Firewall as a service. In fact, we're in the era now where everything is becoming as a service. And firewalls are no different. This is a screen capture from Cloudflare. In fact, it's a screen capture from my course, Getting Started with Cloudflare Security, which looks at how Cloudflare can be used to sit in between your website and the publicly facing internet. Now, Cloudflare does do many different things. For example, it does content optimization and spreads it around a globally distributed CDN. But one of the really important things it does with regards to security is it has this firewall service. Now, Cloudflare certainly isn't the only one that does firewall as a service. Some of the big players that have been doing physical firewalls for many years can also offer it as a service. And the reason why it's attractive as a service is the same reason why so many other things that are now offered in a service-oriented fashion are popular. It's very, very easy to get into. It's a simple turnkey solution. You can ramp it up on demand, pay for what you use, and discard the service when you no longer need it. So that's three different common classes of firewall: software-based, hardware-based, and firewall as a service. Let's now move on, and I want to look at firewall architectures. We're going to look at three different firewall architectures, but I want to start with a definition, and this is important, and it relates not just to firewalls, but to any host that's fully exposed to attack. The concept of a bastion host firewall is that it's going to be the firewall which is facing the public net. It has no defense in front of it. It needs to bear the full brunt of any attack that's targeted at the network. So the bastion host is a really critical piece of infrastructure, simply because it is that first line of defense. Now again, that's a term that's used not just for firewalls, but for any asset that's out there fully exposed to attack. Let's go and look at what this looks like as a firewall. A bastion host firewall is a pretty rudimentary implementation, and indeed that is the role that many firewalls play. It's sitting there between the internet and the internal network, acting, as I said before, as the first line of defense. It is fully exposed. Now, bastion host can still have a couple of different implementations. So for example, it can be a single homed firewall. So that is, it would have one network interface, and all of the traffic would flow both in and out through that interface, and then the software would do the filtering. It could be dual homed, so it could have two network interfaces, and indeed that's a more common implementation, particularly in commercial grade products. So now we're talking about the external traffic coming in through one port and the internal through the other. And of course, we still have software to do the filtering and decide what traffic goes through versus what traffic gets dropped, but we have a greater segmentation of networks courtesy of those two NICs. So that's a bastion host firewall. Let's move on to the next one. A screened subnet firewall, which you might also see called a triple homed firewall, would have three network interfaces, and it divides traffic into three logical network segments. There's the public internet, the internal network, so that would be the same as a typical dual-homed bastion host firewall like we saw on the previous slide. But then we also have the DMZ. Now, the idea of a DMZ, or DMZ depending on where you're from, is that we're talking about a demilitarized zone network. Now, in simple terms, the DMZ is nothing other than a different subnet within a network. It contains assets which you want publicly exposed, so it needs to be accessible via the internet. But that same subnet would also usually be accessible via the internal network, although it may expose different services to each. This is a very common structure for an organization. They have some assets which they'd like facing the public, and of course they have other assets, namely their internal network, which they want clearly segmented away. That screened subnet firewall needs to be able to ensure that those access controls are in place. Now let's just be clear, with both the previous bastion host firewall and the firewall we see here, we do still want traffic going every way. So for example, we want the internal network to be able to make HTTP requests to the internet. So the firewall needs to allow that traffic through. And then of course we need the responses to come back. So it's got to allow HTTP over port 80 and inevitably port 443 for HTTPS as well. It's got to allow that traffic to come back into the internal network. So this is that bi-directional flow of traffic again. And of course, in a case like this, it also needs to be able to allow HTTP requests from the internet to pass through to the DMZ, and then those responses returned. However, in a model like this, we might not want the internet, say, creating FTP connections to the DMZ. It's okay if the internal network FTPs to the DMZ, because they're the ones controlling the assets in those externally facing websites, but that has to be segmented off from the broader internet itself. So you can see here how that screened subnet firewall has to juggle a whole bunch of different rules in terms of where traffic can come from and to, and the ports and protocols it can do that with. Let's look at one more firewall architecture. The multi-homed firewall. It's very similar to the triple-homed firewall we just saw, except now we've got a greater segmentation of networks courtesy of an additional firewall. This is the sort of model that you're likely to see when there's a greater segmentation of networks into various subnets, particularly when we're talking about architectures where we've got something like the DMZ here, which has got all sorts of anonymous external traffic entering into it. It's really important to have a very robust firewall implementation. So in the model here, Firewall 1 can focus on protecting that DMZ, whilst Firewall 2 can focus on protecting the internal network. Now note also that in the multi-homed firewall architecture, the role of the DMZ as a sort of neutral territory between the two networks becomes even clearer. And demilitarized zone is yet another term which has come from the physical world. In wartime, a DMZ was an area of land which formed a buffer between two opposing forces. To this day, there is still a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, an area where conflict may not take place, a buffer between the two nations. So it's another example of where information security is based on concepts that we've taken from the physical world. So that's 3 different firewall architectures: bastion host, screened subnet, which we also call triple-homed, and multi-homed. With that now covered, let's move on and start to look at very specific implementations of firewalls, and in particular, how they protect the networks on either side of them. Let's begin by looking at packet filtering firewalls. A packet filtering firewall is one of the most common implementations of this security control. And you'll normally see it being implemented as a bastion host sort of model, so out there facing the attackers without any other line of defense in front of it. A packet filtering firewall in many ways is pretty rudimentary. We have raw traffic coming in, a set of packet level controls, and then allowable traffic flowing through. But let's take a closer look at those controls. So for example, a packet filtering firewall may define allowable source and destination IP addresses. One place where you may see that is if there's malicious traffic originating from a particular IP address, a packet filtering firewall may simply blacklist it, block any requests that come from that specific IP address. The construction of the TCP header itself is also the sort of thing a packet filtering firewall can look at. So for example, what are the source and destination ports? Should the firewall just allow port 80 for HTTP and 443 for HTTPS? Anything else is not allowed through. Protocols. HTTP is good, maybe SMTP is also good, but anything else such as FTP or ICMP are going to be blocked. Now again, that's quite rudimentary, because whilst you may well want to block things like FTP, because you're worried that it could be used to exfiltrate data, there could also be attacks that come in over HTTP, and a packet filtering firewall will allow that attack to come in, because it doesn't look at the data itself, and it doesn't look at any other information in those request headers as well. It is a very rudimentary control. But again, it's a first line of defense, and we're going to look at other firewalls that may then sit behind this in just a moment. Now remember also, this has to look at traffic coming the other way. So what about traffic, in this case, coming from the internal server and flowing back out to the client? This is important because what if an attacker has compromised the server itself and they're now trying to exfiltrate data out? A packet filtering firewall may limit the attacker's ability to send that data back out externally from the network. Now think also about the way this firewall operates. It is simple conditional IP datagram forwarding. Or in other words, the firewall needs to decide whether it's going to send those packets onwards from the client to the destination, whether that be a server or some other device on the other side of the firewall. A packet filtering firewall will either simply pass the request on or drop it. It just won't go through at all. And that is a very simplistic implementation. It's not particularly intelligent. But one of the reasons packet filtering firewalls remain common is because they are also very low cost. It's easy just to look at something like the port or the protocol that's being used and either allow it or block it. But as I touched on just before, it's also not hard to evade. So as I mentioned, having a malicious attack as part of an HTTP request, that'll just go straight through. So that's the first model of firewall I wanted to look at, packet filtering firewalls. Let's now move on and take a look at circuit level gateway firewalls. Let's just recap very briefly on the OSI model of computer networking. I go into this a bit more deeply in my course on ethical hacking denial of service. And this representation is important because it is frequently a reference point for what level various attacks and controls are running at. So we were just looking at the transport level, at that level 4. So this is where TCP requests, for example, are transiting backwards and forwards. When we start to talk about a circuit level gateway firewall, we're going to go up the stack a bit. We're talking about the session layer, layer 5. And this really sits there as a shim between the application and transport layers. So it is a higher level, more abstract concept than what we're just looking at down at TCP. Let's go and take a look at how this firewall actually works. Most of the time when you're browsing the internet, you're communicating through a circuit level gateway firewall. Now that's very likely in addition to a packet filtering firewall, and just to be clear, the one firewall can perform multiple roles as well. But the role of the circuit level gateway firewall is to relay requests between two separate hosts. So for example, a client and a server. So we may see a TCP request come into the firewall, then be relayed to the server. So here the firewall is acting as a gateway, and then the response come back through that firewall and ultimately back to the client. Now the important thing here is that these two endpoints, the client and the server, are never making a direct connection. Everything goes through that circuit level gateway firewall. So this device is actually creating two connections, one to the client and one to the server. It sits there and monitors things like the three-way TCP handshake. And by doing so, it can establish whether that request is legitimate or not. The circuit level gateway firewall can also make sure that responses actually match up to requests. So is what's coming back out of that server in response to a legitimate request from the client, and should it be allowed back through? Or is someone potentially trying to exfiltrate data out of the network? But as with a packet filtering firewall, a circuit level gateway firewall will still allow a lot of data through that could potentially be for malicious purposes. So for example, if the gateway is designed to allow HTTP communication, and the client is busily exploiting a SQL injection risk in the server itself, then the firewall will allow the requests and responses through. That is legitimate HTTP traffic, at least in terms of conforming to the expected structure of the firewall. It's HTTP over port 80. It's happy. It's going to let that through. It also doesn't provide any packet level defense. It merely confirms that those connections are legitimate. Now this is another model of firewall that you will typically see used on things like home cable modems and routers, and you'll often see it implementing NAT, network address translation, so that you can have multiple clients sitting behind that firewall, all sharing the one internet connection. As with the packet filtering firewall, it's an important part of the infrastructure, but it is very rudimentary. Where things start to get more sophisticated is when we go to an application level gateway firewall. Let's go and take a look at that now. The next type of firewall we'll look at is an application level gateway firewall. Now this one sits much higher up in that OSI model that we saw earlier. It's up at layer 7, so right up the top of the stack. Now often you may see this referred to as a proxy, especially inside corporate networks. And they may also involve authentication in order to identify who the client is. In some ways, it is similar to a circuit level gateway firewall in that it will relay those requests backwards and forwards between two different hosts, but it differs in terms of where it sits in the stack. So for example, we may see it intercepting HTTP traffic, but it's not just HTTP. It can sit up there and look at, say, FTP, SMTP, other protocols that are application specific. And the really important thing about an application level gateway firewall is the ability to actually inspect the traffic contents. Now, depending on which way the traffic is going, this class of firewall can perform very different tasks. So when it is acting as a gateway, where the client is inside a corporate network making external requests, it can do things like block specific sites. On the other hand, when it's sitting there in front of an asset such as a server, if it has the ability to actually inspect the traffic contents, now it can start to do things like look for typical attack patterns. This is what Cloudflare does with their firewall as a service product. Is this request potentially, say, a SQL injection attack? An application level gateway firewall sitting up there at layer 7 and being able to interpret and understand the contents of those requests can be very powerful, much more so than simple implementations such as a packet filtering firewall. Now, of course, it will relay communications backwards and forwards the same as the other firewalls. It needs to be able to take requests and then respond appropriately, but it can do so with a greater level of sophistication. Another example is if SMTP is going backwards and forwards through that firewall, it might allow the hello command, the HELO command, which the client uses to identify itself to the server, but then it might block the verify command, the VRFY command, which is often used to establish if a server has a particular address on it or not. It could be an enumeration risk. Same port, same protocol, but much more granular control in terms of what goes backwards and forwards through the firewall. So it's a higher state of awareness of what the traffic is doing and then what is good versus what is bad. Now there's just one more firewall model I want to take a look at, and that's the stateful multi-layer inspection firewall. The stateful multi-layer inspection firewall is yet another evolution of the previous models that we've looked at. And in fact, it would normally combine aspects of the previous 3 firewall models we looked at: packet filtering, circuit level gateway, and application level gateway. And per the diagram here, we're going to see inspection happen at multiple layers of the communication. We're looking at the TCP/IP model here as opposed to the OSI model we saw earlier on. But logically, they cover the same aspects of the network. And the important thing here is that when we talk about stateful multi-layer inspection, we're talking about the whole stack. So the ability to go all the way from that low level of TCP packets all the way up to the actual application communication protocols as well. Now what this means is that this model of firewall can do all of the things that we've seen so far. So for example, inspect the contents of HTTP requests. But because it's stateful, it can also work across packets and across requests and do things, for example, such as only allowing packets from known active connections. Now that requires a greater level of awareness than just looking at individual packets. It has to look at this broader concept that is a connection. This gives it the ability to do things such as stateful packet inspection, SPI. So rather than treating every single network packet individually as though it was a stateless firewall, it can take a stateful approach and actually look at these packets in a more holistic fashion. In the previous models we looked at, particularly in a model such as a packet filtering firewall, being stateless, it doesn't know if a packet is part of an existing connection or not. It's just a packet. It's based on its own merits. It's not looked at in the broader context. So the stateful model like this is actually connection aware. What all of this together means is that a stateful multi-layer inspection firewall can start making filtering decisions based on cumulative data. So that means not just the information that's flowing through it right now, not just individual packets, but how they fit into this broader concept, which is a connection with requests and responses. And then within that, there are many, many different individual packets. So this has taken us through 4 levels of firewall sophistication: packet level, circuit level gateway, application level gateway, and stateful multi-layer firewalls. All of these classes of firewall are produced by many different manufacturers with many different products designed for many different audiences. There is a really broad array of firewall products out there. But one of the things that an adversary wants to do very early on is to figure out which firewall is sitting there between them and their target. So let's go and take a look at identifying the firewall. When an adversary is in a reconnaissance phase of their attack, they're trying to gather as much information as they possibly can about the network they're looking at. And inevitably, one of the things they want to learn more about is what type of firewall are they dealing with. Not just what type, in terms of the ones that we just looked at, but who actually makes it. Because armed with that information, they may then be able to find specific vulnerabilities in that specific manufacturer's product. So one of the first things they're going to want to do is fingerprint the firewall. Now, I've spoken about fingerprinting in many of my courses before. So for example, HTTP fingerprinting of servers. And what they're trying to do here is look at how the device behaves. So for example, what sort of ports and protocols are supported? Specific manufacturers' firewall products will expose services over different ports. So for example, administration facilities generally tend to be stood up on predictable ports. And when that port is discovered, it's often a strong indicator of who makes the product. Now, something like port scanning can be done with a tool like Nmap. And indeed, that is the canonical product for scanning networks. So that's a good starting point, scanning ports and protocols. Another common technique is banner grabbing. And this is not that different to the way that we'd see banner grabbing happen against a web server. Make a request to the device, receive a response, and within that response is an indication of who makes the product. So in this case, the system is simply announcing what it is. That in itself is not a risk, but to my earlier point about then using that information to go out there and find known vulnerabilities about the product, it can be a gateway to the attacker then being able to compromise the system. So fingerprinting using those open ports and protocols and using banner grabbing are two really straightforward ways of figuring out what firewall product it is. But adversaries often want even more information. They want to know things like the open ports behind the firewall. And that's where firewalking comes in. Let's go and take a look at how that works. Now, what firewalking is trying to do is establish the ports that are open through the firewall. And typically, an adversary using firewalking is going to break the approach down into two phases. So the first phase is they're going to try and walk through each of the gateways between them and the destination host. And you may sometimes see that destination host referred to as the metric. Now, the way they're going to do this is by running trace routes and manipulating the TTL value, the time to live. And they're going to keep incrementing it by 1. And each time they increment it by 1, they're going to be connecting to a different point in the connection. Now, they won't get a successful response until the TTL is high enough to actually hit the destination host. But what the exercise does as it walks through those different gateways is helps them identify the points between that firewalking host and the destination host. So this is what's effectively known as hop count ramping. They just keep bumping up the TTL until they reach the destination host. Now that's the first phase. That helps them establish the points between the firewalking host and the destination host. Now they can move on to phase 2, the actual firewalking. And once they're clear about where that destination host is in terms of the proper TTL count, they can start sending TCP or UDP packets from the scanning host to that destination host, one port at a time, incrementing the TTL. So they're effectively now walking through the available ports and testing each point along the way to see if it's going to respond. Now, if that firewalking host doesn't receive a response for each one of those requests and things just time out, well, then it can make an assumption that that packet was denied via the ACL running on that device. So that allows the adversary to work through incrementally and establish for each point along the way, what are you actually going to support? Regardless of what may then be further downstream from the device, what may be the avenues for the attacker to begin mounting their attack? That now brings us to the crux of this module. Having gained this knowledge, how can the attacker begin evading the defenses that are in place in the firewall. Let's move on and start looking at evasion techniques. Attackers have a number of different evasion techniques available to them. And as we progress through this part of the module, you'll see that they'll each make sense in different circumstances. Let's start here though, IP address spoofing. Now I've spoken about IP address spoofing in my Ethical Hacking Denial of Service course, and this can be used as a means of obfuscating the source address that a request is coming from, but it can also be used as a way of specifying a source address that a firewall will allow as opposed to the attackers, which the firewall may not allow. So let's take a sample scenario. We've got our attacker here. They're on 192.168.2.1. And we've got a destination host over here, and it is on a different subnet. It's on 192.168.1 instead of .2. Now inevitably we have a firewall sitting between these two devices. And in this case, the firewall is designed to stop that attacker's subnet from being able to access the destination host. However, inevitably there are other trusted hosts, probably within the same subnet, and the destination host would happily allow connections from them. In an IP address spoofing scenario, the attacker is going to issue a request where they specify the source address as being from the trusted host. Now, if the firewall is just simply allowing connections based on that source IP address, and an allowable IP address is passed, then that request may well go all the way through to the host. So that's a pretty rudimentary sort of implementation. Understand how the firewall is configured, and this goes to the previous point on identifying the firewall, and particularly things like firewalking, understanding what is allowed by each of those points in the network chain. So understanding what's allowed, and then specifying an allowable source IP address which the firewall happily passes through to the destination host. That's a very quick look at IP address spoofing. Let's go and have a look at the next evasion technique. Source routing. Here's a technique that allows a request to specify how it should be routed through a particular network. You may also see this referred to as path addressing, and it simply means that the packet is going to partially or completely specify the route it should take through the network. So let's imagine we have an attacker and we have a destination host, and the attacker wants to make a connection through to that host, but they're blocked by a firewall that's sitting there in between the two of them. Now, if the attacker is able to use source routing, then they can specify the route the packet must take such that it passes around the firewall. Now, this is opposed to the routers making their own decision about how the packets should be routed, and inevitably in this scenario they would normally route them through the firewall. This evasion technique is also dependent on having an alternate route, having a way around the firewall that doesn't get blocked. So certainly there are a number of things that have to line up in order to make this evasion technique work, but source routing is certainly a popular evasion technique where the network can facilitate it. Another evasion technique is known as the tiny fragment attack. And what the attacker is doing here is actually splitting up a packet into tiny fragments. Now, the reason why this works is because if the firewall is just looking at that first packet and it's a tiny fragment which doesn't actually specify the port, then the firewall may allow that second fragment of the packet which does specify a port, inevitably a port which the firewall would normally block, but in this case the firewall may allow that packet through. So by breaking up and fragmenting the packets in an unexpected fashion, the firewall can get hung up on that first one and ignore the subsequent one. If an attacker can exploit this particular evasion technique, they can continually issue packets broken down into these tiny fragments and skirt right through the firewall without it realizing that the attacker is indeed communicating over the port that it should be blocking. Another evasion technique you'll often see is tunneling. And tunneling can be done using various different approaches. ICMP, so for example via pings or trace routes, the ACK phase of the three-way TCP handshake, or simply via HTTP. Now, whilst the implementation differs across these three, it's the same fundamental principle. We have an attacker and we have a destination host, and of course we have a firewall sitting in between them. Now, what the attacker is trying to do here is actually wrap their malicious payload inside the protocol. So for example, for ICMP, there is a payload portion of an ICMP packet. Some firewalls don't do any inspection on that payload. And if the attacker can get that payload to go all the way through to the destination host and have that target actually unwrap it, execute it, rewrap a response and send it back, then the attacker is able to communicate with the host. Now, to be clear, the attacker also has to compromise the host here. Most hosts aren't just simply going to unwrap an ICMP packet and execute the payload. So now we're looking at a scenario where the attacker is trying to maintain communication with a compromised host. So for example, they may have malicious software running on the host and they want to be able to control it from outside the target network. But this is very often the sort of scenario attackers are trying to work with. Think about the Sony Pictures example I talked about in the opening module, allegedly having control of the network for a year. How did they communicate with the machines inside? How did they pivot between machines? How did they orchestrate the exfiltration of allegedly 100 terabytes of data? Inevitably, there was external control over the devices behind the firewall. In terms of evasion, think about things like HTTP. Most firewalls will happily allow the HTTP protocol over port 80 to pass through. That may well be in response to requests internally that are sent externally because you need to be able to support employees within a network making internet requests. But if you could wrap up commands within those HTTP requests and responses, and the firewall itself wasn't specifically doing any analysis of the contents of those requests, then that could open up an HTTP tunnel for the attacker between their external machine and the destination host behind the firewall. Continuing with the theme of often having a presence behind the firewall and needing to get back out through it, let's look at a few other blocked host evasion techniques. Let's look at a blocked host evasion technique. I'm here in the browser, and let's take a hypothetical scenario here that a particular gateway level firewall doesn't want to allow requests for a particular host name that I would like to access. Now, instead of going to the host name, I'm just going to go straight to the IP address. Let's see what happens. This is obviously just CNN, except I'm not accessing CNN.com, which is our hypothetical blocked host. I'm simply going to the IP address. When the CNN web server receives that request, it's returning exactly the same content that I would have had based on the host. Now, this is relevant in cases where the host name would be blocked. Perhaps not CNN because it's a fairly benign website, but let's imagine it was a more malicious site and the organization running the firewall subscribed to a blacklist of disallowed malicious sites, and they're blocking that host. We just make a request directly via IP address. That's a very, very rudimentary implementation. And certainly many organizations will block the IP address as well as the host. Let's have a look at a few other approaches. There are many different ways of evading a blocked host at the firewall. So we just looked at the host evasion by using IP address. Here's a few other ways that firewall gateways can often be easily circumvented. So one way is by using a proxy. If you route the request through the proxy, which then circumvents the firewall, that can frequently be a viable evasion technique. Another option is using a VPN, so creating an encrypted tunnel between the host on one side of the firewall and a VPN exit node on the other side. Now, of course, the firewall could also be blocking the VPN protocols too. But then there are always options like using Tor, the onion router, routing through Tor can obfuscate the nature of the target site that an attacker is looking to connect to. Now, it may well be that the firewall blocks Tor as well. And the thing with all of these bypass channels, and indeed all of the evasion techniques that we've looked at so far in this module, is that every single one of them has countermeasures. But just as all of these have been viable at many times in the past, and many of them do continue to be viable as well, there will also be many more. There'll be other ways of tunneling, other routing techniques, other bypass channels like the ones that you see here. As I said earlier on in the course, it is an arms race. And as our defenses progress, so too will the evasion techniques. Let's go and look at one more thing before we wrap up the course, and that's a few evasion tools. There are dozens and dozens of evasion tools out there, using many of the techniques that we've just looked at, and inevitably using all new techniques that are yet to come to light. I want to touch on just a few to give you a bit of a theme of how these tools tend to operate. And here's where we'll start. G-tunnel. And what we can see here is that the evasion effectively uses a G-tunnel proxy. So the traffic is going to go through the G-tunnel servers before it then goes out to the destination server. So G-tunnel is going to sit there in the middle. The destination isn't going to know who the user is, and when the user makes the request through the G-tunnel servers, any firewalls sitting between the user and those servers isn't going to know where the traffic is going. Now, one of the interesting things about G-tunnel, about firewall evasion products, and about security in general is very often there's a fine line between tools that are intended to protect individuals and those which are used to exploit organizations. Now, G-tunnel and many of the other evasion technique tools that you'll see talk about anti-censorship, internet privacy, human rights, and what all of these have in common with evasion of firewalls is the desire to protect the nature of the traffic that's flowing through these security devices. So keep that in mind as you're looking at evasion tools. Very often you'll see them classified under those banners of privacy and anti-censorship. So G-tunnel is one. Let's take a look at another one. HTTP tunnel is a good example of tunneling over HTTP. And as you can see here in the description of this project on GitHub, it's designed specifically for users behind restrictive firewalls. So again, think about how these contexts can be used in very different ways. Whilst the project here represents this tool as being used for someone to be able to access content, assumably in a fairly honest, legitimate way, you can see how this would also be attractive for an adversary wanting to tunnel back out through a firewall in order to exfiltrate data from an organization. So as much as this tool could be used in a fairly benign fashion, it's also very valid and very useful for malicious purposes. So that's a very relevant observation in terms of this class of tool, and HTTP tunnel is a great example of tunneling software designed specifically for evasion. Let's look at one more tool that's very useful when you're looking at evading firewalls. I mentioned Nmap earlier on, and certainly I've mentioned it in other courses as well, and it really is the tool for all sorts of network-related reconnaissance. Now, as you can see here, one of the things that Nmap talks very specifically about is firewall and IDS evasion, and in this case, spoofing as well. Nmap is a great way of establishing the network topology, and not just the topology in terms of what sort of assets sit on that network, but what sort of ports, protocols, communication mechanisms may be available to those machines. In this case, one of the things that Nmap talks about a little bit further down the page is fragmented packets. So we looked at tiny fragments a little bit earlier on in this module. And Nmap does have a mechanism of testing how resilient a target firewall is to the tiny fragments evasion pattern. Now, there are many more things that Nmap can help you do in terms of looking at the ability to evade not just firewalls, but intrusion detection systems as well, which we'll look at in the next module. And certainly this tool is one of the first places you'd start when looking at evasion techniques. So that's everything I wanted to cover in the module. Let's now move on to the summary. Let's summarize the module. And one of the first things we did is to have a look at just how many different types of firewall there are. Not just types, but architectures as well. So we looked at bastion host firewalls, screen subnets, multi-homed firewalls, and then implementations such as a packet filtering firewall, circuit level gateway, application level gateway, and stateful multi-layer firewalls. And the point here is that there is a really broad breadth of defenses available at the network level. Now, as a result, what we'll often see is these defensive patterns being combined or complemented. So not just having packet level filtering, which is important, but also not very sophisticated, and complementing that with an application level gateway. Now these may all be bundled up into a product, such as a stateful multi-layer firewall. But the point here is that it's an example of defense in depth. Multiple layers of defense defending networks against different classes of attack. But just as we have a good range of defenses in our firewalls, we also have a good range of evasion techniques. Often, these techniques work in many different ways. Spoofing the IP address, source routing using tiny fragments, or tunneling through protocols such as ICMP. And if none of that works, getting traffic back out, particularly when there's already a compromised machine internally, can happen via all sorts of other very common implementations. Going direct to the IP address, using anonymous proxies for surfing, VPNs, Tor, and as we just saw with the evasion tools, some of these are really easily available. In fact, they're so easily available that they're not necessarily considered malicious tools at all. They're tools for anti-censorship or privacy. And as I just mentioned in that section of the course, sometimes there's a pretty fine line between legitimate, honest use and malicious intent. So that's firewalls. Let's now move on to the next module and take a look at intrusion detection systems. Let's start here, and it's a pretty simple definition, and certainly the name itself is pretty self-explanatory. So we're talking about a device here, or a software application, that's looking to identify malicious activity. Now that malicious activity may be on the network, it may be on the system, very frequently in the file system. And the IDS is trying to identify policy violations. And part of what we're going to talk about in this module is the sorts of policies that an IDS looks for. Now, one of the things about an IDS is that it typically produces reports. It doesn't always just necessarily block like a firewall does. It certainly can block, in which case we're talking more about an intrusion protection system when it starts dropping packets and disallowing traffic. But the one common thread they all have is this reporting ability. Before we start going into the mechanics of how an IDS works, let me give you a few examples of the different ways an IDS can work that are analogous with security controls that you'll be familiar with in the physical world. We just looked at firewalls, which in many ways is similar to the lock on the door. Authorized traffic can pass through freely, and of course to be authorized in the physical world you need the key. Traffic that shouldn't be allowed gets stopped. And of course this is the way firewalls operate, either let the traffic through or block it. And as I said earlier, an IDS can operate this way as well. So it can do prevention and actually stop the attack, as well as doing detection, which brings me to the next analogy. One of the features that many intrusion detection systems have is packet logging. So just observe everything that's happening around it and save the information. That's not going to stop the attack from happening, and someone's going to have to go back and actually analyze the data that's been collected at a later date. Just as though they were going back through video footage, they're going to need to review it and see if they can identify any malicious patterns. So this is one of the modes that you'll see intrusion detection systems working in. And think back to this analogy when we talk about packet logging. Let's have a look at one more. Intrusion detection systems often operate in a sniffer mode, so they're looking for malicious activity. And like the packet logging or video camera analogy we just saw, it's not going to stop the attack. But what a sniffer will do is it will raise the alarm when it actually sees one. So that's analogous to the security sensor. When it observes behavior that shouldn't be there, it's going to let someone know, and then obviously some action will need to be taken, but it's not actually going to stop the event either. And that's really important. And it's partly due to the fact that sometimes an IDS is just simply not in the position to stop an event from occurring. So for example, it may not be able to stop the fact that someone with administrative privileges is changing the contents of a file on a server, but it can raise a flag and say, hey, maybe this is something you should look into further, just to make sure that it wasn't done by some malicious process. So that's 3 quick examples, and we do often talk about these 3 modes that an IDS can run in. In fact, later on in this module, when we look at the snort IDS, we'll talk specifically about these 3 modes. For now though, let's move on and just have a quick look at how an IDS differs from a firewall. One thing that certainly both an IDS and a firewall has in common is that they're both related to the security of information systems. Frequently to network-related security, although certainly an IDS can look at file systems and system configurations as well. When we looked at firewalls though, we talked very much about the firewall sitting in between the attacker and the target system, which for example is an internal network. Now firewalls are often there to try and limit access between networks, so they're there to try and prevent intrusion. One of the big shortcomings of a firewall is that should the attacker actually be behind it, so for example in the internal network, the attacker could be in the network modifying files and system configurations, and the firewall just doesn't come into play at all. An IDS is much better at evaluating suspected intrusions once they take place. And they're also very good at catching intrusions that happen from behind the firewall within the network. And when you think back to the 2 examples I gave in the opening module, the one on Sony Pictures and Ashley Madison, there was a lot of speculation that those attacks may well have originated from behind the firewall, inside the network. So it raises the question, was there an IDS within that network that could have possibly identified those attacks? Now we're going to talk more specifically about how an IDS works in a moment. Some of it is similar to a firewall. It's going to look at things like network communications, but they can also be quite a bit more sophisticated too. Now, like a firewall, an IDS can sit at multiple places in the infrastructure. So for example, it could well sit within that internal network, monitoring the environments around it. That may mean that traffic is passing through it, and certainly many of the examples that I'm going to give you in this module do relate to IDSs that can intercept traffic, and that would very much be a network level intrusion detection system. But it could also just sit on a host as a host-based intrusion detection system. We're going to talk about both of those in this module as well. One of the things that helps make the role of an IDS much clearer is when we have a think about how much goes on behind the firewall. Let me show you what I mean. Consider the modern day network and have a think about all the things that we have sitting behind that firewall. So clearly, one of the things we have is servers. Many modern networks have a whole bunch of them sitting within internal network segments these days. And of course, we've then got things like databases as well. And databases are very attractive targets for attackers because that's where the data lies. That's often the holy grail of what they're actually looking for within a network. So think about what ability we have within this ecosystem to identify potentially malicious activity directed at the database. Now obviously we also have a lot of client machines as well, and inevitably we have defenses on those such as antivirus, but that's not necessarily going to stop an attacker from compromising one of those machines and using it as a pivot point to then access the other sorts of resources you see on the screen here. Think about the other things we have connected within a network these days as well. Things like printers and telephones. there's been attacks against these. These are all network connected devices these days. Modified malicious firmware originating from your printer. That's all sitting behind the firewall. What ability is there to identify malicious activity from the printer against other targets within the network? Obviously, smartphones are another increasingly popular attack vector as well. They're very intelligent little computers that everyone has in their pocket and are very often connected to the same network as these other devices. And it's not just mobile items like smartphones as well. The era of the Internet of Things is meaning we're getting all sorts of other devices connected into the network. And we've seen many vulnerabilities in these too. We've literally seen vulnerabilities in connected light globes. These are being placed inside the network. What are the protections against malicious activity from IoT devices? Inevitably, many of these are wireless. So we have wireless base stations. That's an attractive target for an attacker. If they can gain access via wireless, that may well put them directly behind the firewall. And even if we take out all the networking components we see here, and we go back to simple physical media, what protection do we have if something malicious is introduced to the environment via USB? That's a very well-known attack vector. Antivirus on the PC might get it, but when it doesn't, and something malicious starts interacting with the servers or the database within the network, what is there that's going to be able to identify that abnormal behavior behind the firewall and raise the alarm? This is where the intrusion detection system really has a unique role to play, one that can't be played by firewall alone. Let's look at a couple of more IDS related facts before we move on. So one thing that you may see when it comes to an IDS is you may see it being referred to as a packet sniffer. And a packet sniffer goes back to that analogy of the security camera, looking at traffic that goes past, recording it, but not necessarily stopping it from doing anything malicious. And this was the point. This is where they're different to firewalls. They're not necessarily going to stop it, but they do often have the ability to alert an administrator. Now, one of the key features of an IDS is this ability to record so that you can go back and play this back later on. There are IDS products out there that will do things like just log all of the packets that go through. It may not identify anything at the time it's being logged. And in fact, there may well be attacks going on which simply haven't been seen before. You wouldn't even know what to look for. But when those packets are captured, and particularly once new attack patterns are identified, then there's something to go back and actually inspect. So whether it's recording those raw PCAPs as a sniffer might, or recording the events, a really key part of an IDS is actually logging information. Now, as I said earlier, they may simply detect and report, and this would be a very passive system. It's not going to stop anything, it's just going to look at what's going on around it. Or it might actually completely block. And that then becomes a reactive system. It's going to see something that's potentially malicious and it's going to stop it, like we would see with a firewall. Now, once we get into this area, we're now talking intrusion protection. Let's do a quick definition on IPS before we move on. Sometimes the line between IDS and IPS is a little bit grey. The main difference being that when we talk about protection, we are actually talking about a barrier. We're going back to the door lock analogy, so something that will actually stop malicious traffic. It may still have many of the other features of an IDS, such as logging traffic and logging events, but it will actually proactively stop attacks. As we go through this module, you'll see a number of cases where an IDS does have the ability to act as an IPS, and you will frequently see those terms used a little bit interchangeably. With that said though, let's move on and start defining some very specific classes of intrusion detection system. One of the most fundamental implementations of an IDS is a signature-based intrusion detection system. And signatures are simply known bad patterns. Or in other words, they're a blacklist of what we think is bad. Let's have a look at how that might work. So imagine we have a client, and the client is going to make requests that go via an IDS. Now the IDS is going to look at that traffic and it's going to refer down to its signature database. Because this is what signatures are, they're just large collections of patterns. And it's the IDS's role to match the traffic against the known bad patterns and then make a call on whether that traffic gets passed through to the host. So in a case like this, the IDS could be playing that IPS role if it actually drops packets that match a bad signature, or it could simply be logging it for later review and passing the traffic on regardless. Now in many cases this works quite well, although later on we are going to talk about how to actually evade this pattern. But one of the things that is always a bit of a risk is false positives. So what if legitimate traffic actually gets matched to a known bad signature? This makes it really important to get signatures right. They can't be too liberal, otherwise you lose good traffic, and they can't be too strict, otherwise you may miss malicious traffic. Let's go and take a look at what a signature looks like. In 2014, we had the Heartbleed bug. And this was a risk in the OpenSSL library. And soon after the vulnerability was discovered, we saw signatures for intrusion detection systems. Now, probably the most prominent IDS out there is Snort, and we're going to look at Snort in more detail later on. But this is what a Snort Heartbleed signature looks like. This is actually one of the signatures provided by the FBI in the wake of the Heartbleed incident so that organisations could detect potential attacks that exploited the vulnerability. When we look at Snort in more detail later on, I'm going to break this signature down and explain how it's constructed. But for the sake of understanding signature-based intrusion detection systems, all we need to know now is that a signature is actually very simple. It's just what we see here. Now, the signature was never meant to be the complete defense. Ideally, people needed to go out and actually patch the underlying vulnerability. But what the Snort signature did was made it very easy for them to load this in very quickly, without the need for all the other sorts of testing that often goes on when you patch a system, and identify and potentially block this attack very, very early on. So it made a lot of sense to get this signature early, get it into the IDS, and then in parallel get the underlying vulnerability patched. But there's a problem with signatures like this. Let me show you what it is. Let's think about the life cycle of a signature like the one we just saw for Heartbleed. There was an attack developed. So Heartbleed was exploiting the TLS heartbeat extension in the SSL protocol. After the attack was developed and after we knew that it was a risk, people started preparing signatures, like the FBI on the previous slide. And then eventually, systems were protected. The signature got rolled out into the intrusion detection systems. But we had this period here, we had this gap. The gap between when the vulnerability became known and when the systems were actually protected. And this is the risk. Signatures are always reactive. After we know that something is bad, then we can build a signature for it. But between the time of knowing it's bad and actually getting the signature rolled out, we have this underlying risk. Systems can remain exposed for quite some time. It all comes down to how quickly you can get those signatures, get them installed in your IDS. This is the same problem as we've had with antivirus for years and years. They're very dependent on looking for known bad patterns. Not so good at looking for unknown bad patterns. But we do have other defenses to try and fill that gap. Let's go on and take a look at a statistical anomaly-based IDS. In the previous module on firewalls, I talked about establishing what's normal versus what's unusual. And this is really what we mean by a statistical anomaly-based IDS. Establishing a baseline of what we know to be good, and then when traffic doesn't match that baseline, so it becomes anomalous, then assuming that it is bad and taking appropriate action. So this is very much the difference between a blacklist approach, which is the signature-based IDS, and the whitelist approach, which is the statistical anomaly-based IDS. Now, all of this is predicated on actually establishing what good traffic is. And all of that begins by defining an anomaly model. When we talk about an anomaly model, we're trying to define what our normal traffic looks like. Now for a statistical anomaly-based IDS, that means beginning with training. So the IDS has to learn what is normal traffic. What does traffic on our network look like? Where does it flow from and to? What ports does it use? What protocols does it use? What time of day does the traffic flow? So think about all these heuristics which can be used to define what a normal working environment actually looks like. Now with that model defined, inevitably there is a testing phase. You have to go through and establish how good the model is at actually flagging anomalous traffic. So does the IDS actually identify it when there's a sudden influx of traffic going out from a particular IP? Or using a very unfamiliar protocol or port, is it actually going to pick up on that? And of course, over time, it needs to be maintained as well, because traffic patterns change. You get new applications, new devices, new network configurations. And without continually maintaining the anomaly model, you run the risk of either having false positives, so it's picking up on legitimate traffic, or the anomaly model is too liberal, and you get attacks actually working through within the constraints of the model. And certainly that's one of the things that we're going to look at when we get to evasion techniques later on in the module. So the statistical anomaly model can look at the normal utilization of the environment, but there's another anomaly model we can work with as well. Protocol anomaly detection. Now in many ways, this is a simpler proposition because protocols are based on spec. So for example, TCP, we understand how it's meant to operate with the three-way handshake. We understand the construction of headers and bodies and all sorts of other things which an IDS can look for at the protocol level. Not only that, but we know that there are other behavioral norms within protocols such as not having duplicate MAC addresses or IP addresses, the allowable URI characters. All of these things are defined in the protocol specs. And an IDS that has the ability to identify anomalous protocol behavior can be an enormously useful tool. It doesn't have the same training dependencies as the statistical anomaly-based model that has to look at the network, and it also doesn't have the same requirements to keep updating it like you have with that statistical model, and for that matter like you also have with the signature-based IDS. So that's two different ways of looking at anomalous traffic. Let's delve a little bit deeper. The intelligence of the IDS when we're talking about anomalies is really important. And as these systems evolve, we get more and more intelligent models, artificial intelligence in some cases, that's able to accurately know whether traffic is going to be legitimate or not based on the norms of the environment, based on normal patterns. We do use this term quite a bit, artificial intelligence, but you can see how it would apply here. If the system was smart enough to know what is likely to be abnormal and potentially at risk. So the AI model is very interesting, albeit something very difficult to get right. On the other hand, we may have a very strict mathematical model, which we'd refer to as strict anomaly detection. So now it can be much clearer about the norms that are expected. Traffic should look like this. If it does not look like this, then it may be bad. But as I mentioned with all of these, we do have this ongoing risk, the false positive risk, because we don't want to see legitimate traffic being categorized as bad. We don't want the noise I just mentioned that goes to administrators, and we also don't want the blocking that might happen in a more IPS-orientated environment. On the other hand, it is easy to miss attacks being delivered via correctly formed traffic. So back in the firewall module, I mentioned that even though the firewall may be correctly allowing only TCP traffic over port 80 and 443 and rejecting other traffic, you can still deliver very malicious attacks over TCP. And indeed, part of what we're going to look at in the evasion section of this module is what are the ways that we can pass traffic via an IDS which doesn't set it off, yet contains a malicious payload. That is the crux of evading an IDS. So that's a look at anomalous behavior. Let's now go and look at a couple of different models of how an IDS may be rolled out within an organization. And I want to start with a network-based IDS. So we're going to look at a few different ways that an IDS can be implemented within an environment. And a network intrusion detection system, which you'll often see abbreviated to a NIDS, is one of the most common implementations. The name is self-explanatory. It's going to sit there at the network layer. We want to see traffic passing through it. Now, this may mean that you have one or many NIDS sitting within an environment, depending on the way your traffic flows and which traffic you actually want to monitor. Ideally, you'll catch not just the ingress and egress traffic from a network, but the traffic going within the network as well. So think back to that earlier diagram we looked at, with all the different devices that we have within a network today. A network intrusion detection system is the right sort of device to pick up many of the risks that can come via those, so long as it can sit there somewhere in the traffic and observe the packets. Let's drill into this a little bit deeper. Often, you'll see a network-based intrusion detection system monitoring traffic on a particular subnet. And one of the most common implementations is to monitor traffic that's coming in and out of that subnet, the ingress and egress traffic. One of the problems, though, with dropping these network devices into the traffic flow is bottlenecks. So if something's going to be there looking at every single packet that goes through, there has to be some overhead there. Now, some overhead may well be quite acceptable. It's a question of degrees. But clearly, as traffic flow increases, and particularly as the complexity of traffic increases as well. So what about compressed data? What about encrypted data? How does the IDS handle that? As we start to get to those more complex models, it becomes more difficult for the network intrusion detection system to play that role. But there are a couple of different ways that we can roll the NIDS out. So one is in an online model. So this is where we are actually looking at all the traffic that's going through that device in real time. This gives it the ability to do just detection or protection as well, and start dropping potentially malicious packets. On the other hand, the device could operate in offline mode. So now we're talking about just sniffing, saving the packets somewhere, then reviewing them later on. Now that's obviously going to have a lower overhead because you don't have to inspect everything before passing it through. But then it's also not going to give you the same levels of protection. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. So that's the network implementation of an IDS. Let's go and look at a host intrusion detection system. When we start to talk about a host intrusion detection system, or a HIDS, now, as the term implies, we're looking at an IDS that actually runs on an individual host, as opposed to sitting out there on the network in front of a whole bunch of different devices. Now, sometimes you might also see this referred to as a HIPS, a host intrusion protection or prevention system. So just like IDS and IPS, we have HIDS and HIPS. It's similar to what we covered in the previous module on firewalls as well. So often these will be a device that actually sit out there on the network protecting multiple systems, whereas other times you may see it running specifically on a host. Very often a combination of the two. And it's the same with IDS as well. We could well have a very specific host intrusion detection system sitting on one key piece of infrastructure within an environment that's also protected via a network intrusion detection system. Let's drill down further into host intrusion detection systems. There are a number of advantages of running an IDS on the host itself. And one of those is it can be very specifically tailored to that host. So what exactly is that host meant to do? What sort of traffic does it expect to send in and out? That's quite likely a much more restrictive set of rules than the broader network. So for example, a host intrusion detection system for a database server is going to be different to that for a web server, but if they're both sitting behind the one network-based intrusion detection system, then obviously that NIDS is going to have the combined rules of the two of them, whereas the individual HIDS systems on the web server and the database can be tailored very specifically for, say, HTTP port 80 traffic versus possibly port 1433 going to the database. A host intrusion detection system may also look at files on the system, and this is where we start to go beyond just the network itself. Monitoring network traffic is extremely important. It's often the way malicious actors enter the environment in the first place. at least when we're not talking about an attack vector such as a USB stick. But as we'll see later on in this module when we get to the bit on evasion, detecting attacks on the network is not foolproof either. So being able to actually look at what's going on that file system in addition to the network can be very valuable. And an IDS tailored very specifically for the host it's monitoring can do that exceptionally well. It's also better at identifying insider abuse. So particularly where that insider may sit within the subnet that a network intrusion detection system would otherwise be protecting. So what if they're already behind there? If the insider is forced through the host intrusion detection system, or if it can identify changes that they're making to the system, then that gives a defensive advantage that you don't get at the network level itself. Now, one of the sorts of things that an insider or another class of attacker does frequently want to change is configuration. And a host intrusion detection system can be a very effective way of looking specifically at the configuration of a machine. So for example, has the machine had ACLs changed on it, or other configuration changes that might make it more liberally accessible? A change to configuration is something an administrator really should know about, so being able to alert them early can be enormously valuable. So that's NIDS and HIDS. Let's go on and touch very briefly on a few other different classes of IDS. We've looked at network-based IDS and host-based IDS. Let's touch very briefly on three other classes of IDS. One of them is log file monitoring. Log files can contain really valuable data. So for example, if you have a web application server, think about the sorts of malicious activity that gets logged. SQL injection attacks are a perfect example. Directory traversal, another good example. Direct object reference manipulation. All of these different classes of attack would get logged to the web server log files. A log file monitoring IDS that's able to go through and review those log files may identify attacks very early on. Now, of course, it's not going to be able to protect. It's looking at log files that are written after the request has already come in and been processed, but it can be an early detection mechanism. File integrity checking as well. So have a think about attacks like ransomware. There's a really good example of how files might be changed en masse and their integrity fundamentally changed. Malicious software that attempts to encrypt files like Word documents, Excel documents, could be identified via file integrity checking. Another class of IDS again is a system integrity verifier. You may see this abbreviated as SIV or SIV. And now we're talking about the ability to look at things like registry changes, very similar to a host-based IDS, but very specific to the overall integrity of the environment. Changes to the registry are exactly the sort of thing an attacker would like to do in order to weaken a target environment and give them greater control over the system. All of these models are evolving. Defenders get better at looking for malicious attacks, and attackers get more creative at finding new and ingenious ways into systems. So we keep talking about this arms race, how one improves and it drives the other to get better, and then the other one gets better, and they keep leapfrogging each other in terms of capabilities. So particularly around something like the sophistication of attacks and the ability to detect them, it's an area that keeps moving very quickly. So that's a bunch of different ways that intrusion detection systems can be configured and run. Now there's one more thing I want to do before we start looking at specific evasion techniques, and that's to go and take a closer look at one of the most popular intrusion detection systems out there, and that's Snort. We're going to look at a few different ways of evading an IDS by breaking apart IP datagrams. Or in other words, we're going to fragment the packets. Let's start with this approach. We have an attacker, and the attacker is trying to evade an IDS that has a fragmentation timeout of 15 seconds. Now what we're talking about here is an IP fragment reassembly timeout, and this refers to the maximum amount of time a fragment will be held unassembled before it expires and it's flushed. So consider any host talking over TCP with multiple fragments passing through it that it needs to reassemble. That fragment reassembly timeout is what keeps it from holding on to uncompleted fragments for perpetuity. Now let's assume we've got a 15-second timeout here on the IDS. And then we've got the victim machine with a 30-second fragmentation reassembly timeout. The attacker is now going to send fragment number 1, which the IDS will hold, and then pass through to the victim. There's nothing wrong with this fragment. That victim machine also holds on to fragment number 1. What happens now is that the attacker waits more than 15 seconds, because after 15 seconds, the IDS is going to drop the fragment. The attacker then comes back and sends fragment number 2 through to the IDS, which then goes through to the victim machine. Now the IDS has got fragment number 2, and only number 2 because it dropped number 1. But the victim has got both fragments, and both of the fragments together form a malicious payload. The IDS never saw the whole thing together because it dropped fragment 1 after that initial 15 seconds. So in a fragmentation attack, the attacker is simply breaking down that packet and making sure that the IDS never has the entire thing and is able to identify a malicious payload. Now this particular attack works when the timeout on the IDS is less than that of the timeout on the victim. But an attacker can still work this attack when it's the other way around as well, when the IDS has a higher timeout than the victim. The attacker simply fragments the packet again, sends enough packets that contain the malicious payload to the victim, waits until the fragmentation timeout of the victim is exceeded, and then sends additional packets within the fragmentation timeout of the IDS that are bogus and cause the IDS to discard the whole packet. So it works the other way around, but the end result is still the same. The victim is the only machine that actually ends up holding all of the fragments that create the payload, whereas the IDS is either discarded part of the malicious payload or is being given other fragments that render it invalid. So that's the first example of a fragmentation attack. Let's move on to another one. This is a slide from my ethical hacking session hijacking course, and it's just a very simple representation of how TCP sequence numbers work. The sequence numbers help keep our packets in order, and they do this through a combination of sequence numbers, acknowledgement numbers, and the size of the packet itself. When it all works right, everything lines up. The acknowledgement number simply becomes the sum of the sequence number and the length of the previous packet. But let's have a look at what happens when it doesn't line up quite right. Overlapping fragments attack. The name is kind of self-explanatory, but let's walk through it anyway. Let's bring in our attacker again, our IDS and our victim. Now, under normal circumstances, the attacker is going to send data to the IDS, and it's going to send it again as a fragmented packet. But we've got 3 fragments here, and all of our sequence numbers line up just as we saw in the previous slide. The IDS will naturally pass those on to the victim's machine, and the packet will be reassembled at the other end. But let's take that away and try it a little bit differently. So we're going to get the attacker to send the fragments in a way that they overlap. Now, what it means by overlapping is that the fragments are going to contain conflicting information about where they start and begin, such that they do appear to actually lay on top of each other. Now, the trick with an overlapping fragment attack is that different machines will reassemble overlapping fragments in different ways. So the IDS may look at that overlapping fragment like this. Let's say prioritizing fragment 3 and fragment 2 over fragment 1. But when they get passed through to the victim's machine, it does it the other way around. It prioritizes fragment 1 over 3 and 2. And not only are these fragments overlapping, but they're being sent out of order as well. And the way these machines piece them back together makes a difference between reconstructing a legitimate packet, which contains a malicious payload, versus reconstructing a packet which is then discarded because it appears to be malformed. The trick is constructing the overlapping fragments such that the IDS is the one that doesn't see the malicious payload of the packet, and the victim is the one that reconstructs those overlapping fragments in such a way that it actually executes the contents. You might also see this referred to as a teardrop attack. And part of this as well is dependent on the attacker actually understanding what IDS is running and what the actual victim is running, because they need to know how are these fragments going to be reconstructed. Let's look at one more fragmentation-based attack. A time to live attack. Let's take our attacker and our IDS again and also our victim again. And what the attacker is going to do now is send a fragment with a high TTL. That fragment will then go all the way through to the victim. The TTL is high enough that it will actually reach its intended destination. The attacker is then going to send another fragment, but this time with a low TTL and a bad payload. Now the TTL is going to be high enough to reach the IDS, but low enough that it doesn't reach the victim. So it's going to stop right there. They'll then send another fragment, also with a high TTL, and it will go all the way through to the victim. Finally, the attacker can resend fragment 2, but this time with a good payload and a high TTL, such that it goes all the way through to the victim. Now the trick here is that the IDS, having received that bad payload from the initial low TTL fragment, is going to ignore the packet. It doesn't look legitimate. But because the victim never got that bad payload, they've only gotten legitimate fragments. And then they reassemble those fragments into the packet which contained the malicious payload. Now the whole premise of forcing an IDS to read invalid packets is sometimes known as an insertion attack. And really this is an attempt to confuse it and to conceal the underlying attack that exists in those other legitimate packets. So that's 3 different mechanisms of evasion by fragmentation. Let's go and look at some other evasion techniques. It's hard to talk about intrusion detection systems and not touch on Snort. It is enormously popular. Part of the reason it's so popular is that it's free and open source, so it's very easily accessible to a very broad range of organizations. Snort operates at many of the levels we've just looked at. So for example, it can do real-time traffic analysis, it can do packet logging. It works across TCP, UDP and ICMP, and it can be configured to run in 3 primary modes. Let's take a look at those. You can run Snort as a sniffer, so read packets that go backwards and forwards and then display them on a console somewhere. So think back to that analogy of the security sensor in a room, watching for suspicious activity and then raising the alarm if it sees it. It can also act as a packet logger, so simply capturing and storing all the network traffic that goes through it. That's more analogous to the security camera model. It's not going to stop the attack, but it is going to collect evidence so that it can be reviewed later on. Or thirdly, it can play a network intrusion detection role. And now we're talking about actually performing actions based on the packet contents. So now we're back at the door lock analogy. Is this traffic allowable? And then if not, there are rules we can apply, such as not opening the door, dropping the packet, blocking the traffic. Snort is very heavily dependent on signatures. And we saw a signature for Heartbleed a little bit earlier on in this module. But I want to go and look at it in more detail now and break it down and explain how Snort uses signatures. Here's the Snort Heartbleed signature we saw just a little bit earlier on. And I want to break this apart because it will give you a much better understanding of how an IDS signature actually works. The first part here is the action. And this signature is going to raise an alert. It's going to do that over the TCP protocol. And it's going to look for any source IP address and any source port. As we go through this, think about the different values you might have here. So for example, you might only be worried about traffic from various sources, whether that be IP or port. You might only be worried about UDP traffic or ICMP traffic. For Heartbleed though, it's TCP from any IP or port, and then our directional operator is saying that it can be to any destination IP address as well. So it's actually saying it can go either way, from any IP to any IP. That's why the directional operator points both ways. We then have the destination ports. So if this traffic is observed going to any of these ports here, it is going to raise the alert. And finally, the actual payload detection. And this is a combination of what we want to be looking for in the packet. And we can see that first part of the payload detection there, the content. Take a note of those first few bytes as well. We're going to come back to that shortly. And then where it should look for it in the packet, and even the message that should be raised if a match is found. In this case, it's SSL v3 malicious heartbleed request. So an IDS signature can actually be a pretty rudimentary tool. It's pretty straightforward. This has the advantage of making them quite simple to write and maintain, but the simplicity can also be quite easy to circumvent as well. With that in mind, let's move on and have a look at how we would evade this specific signature. Let's get started with evasion by obfuscation. This is a really good place to start looking at evasion for a few different reasons. We're looking at a blog post by Robert Graham, and he starts off by saying, "I don't like the emerging threat rules." And what he's saying here is that he has a dislike of the sorts of signatures we just saw for Snort, not because the rules themselves are bad, but because people create an unhealthy dependency on them. So he has a great example here about Heartbleed, and he was receiving messages from people saying, "Hey, stop scanning me," because their IDS signatures were looking for scans using that particular pattern that we just saw with Snort. And Robert shows that pattern just here, where he repeats the first couple of bytes of that TCP packet. But he then goes on to explain it's extremely easy to still scan for the Heartbleed risk, but not have those bytes at the start of the packet. And in fact, he says he just pushed that pattern deeper into the payload and then rescanned the internet. And no one complained, because they were no longer detecting the fact that he was scanning them. Now, fortunately, Robert's objectives were entirely ethical, but you can see how simple it can be to evade an IDS when it's dependent on a known signature. You just need to change the signature in a way that it still achieves its intended objective, but it doesn't trigger the signature detection. Let's go and look at some other mechanisms of evasion by obfuscation. Polymorphic code. This is a popular pattern not just for evading IDSs, but for evading things like antivirus as well. And what we're talking about here is the ability to actually mutate or modify the code such that the original algorithm still functions as designed, but it no longer adheres to a predictable pattern. Now that may also mean that the code actually changes each time it runs. This is the polymorphic nature of it. It can take on multiple different shapes. And often this means actually encrypting components of the payload as well. So we're talking about writing the same code, doing the same thing, but simply making it look different in a way that it can't be detected. Let's look at another approach. ASCII shellcode is another way of evading an IDS. And encoding as an evasion technique is used really extensively throughout information security. When you can represent characters using an encoding such as ASCII, where it doesn't change their function when it executes, but it changes the pattern that they're represented with, this again can be a good way, particularly for evading the signature-based sorts of IDS implementations we saw earlier. Just like the polymorphic code, it still has the same action when it's actually executed. It's simply presented in a way that it can't be detected. Let's look at a few other obfuscation approaches. There are many different ways of disguising malicious payloads in very innocent-looking fashions. Here's three more. One is Unicode. This allows an attacker to have different representations of the same character, which will execute in the same way, but again can evade detection because they don't adhere to the pattern that's being looked for. Encrypted or compressed payloads. If the IDS isn't expressly decompressing the payload, or if encryption, particularly encryption at the transport layer, isn't decrypted before passing through the IDS, then malicious payloads can pass right through. They're undetectable because they're obfuscated away in these compressed or encrypted packets. And session splicing. Some IDSs don't reconstruct the session before pattern matching is done. So for example, if an attacker can deliver packets with enough delay between them that the IDS stops reassembling them and merely passes them through, they can conceal that payload and circumvent the controls of the IDS. So that's just another few ways of evasion by obfuscation, hiding the attacks in such a way that they slip right through the IDS. Let's move on to another set of evasion techniques, and that's evasion by fragmentation. We've just looked at evasion by obfuscation and evasion by fragmentation, but there are other ways of evading an IDS as well, and I want to look at a few more here. Now, one of those is by using denial of service attacks, and we're going to touch on resource exhaustion as well. Now, I've got an entire course on ethical hacking denial of service, which talks about how to take systems offline using a DOS attack. But a DOS attack doesn't necessarily have to take a system offline. It can also result in it being hard for humans to do their job. Let me give you an example. An attacker might decide to flood the IDS with traffic. This is traffic which is going to trigger the IDS to raise alerts. Now, this traffic may have never been intended to actually exploit any underlying risk in the system. But if the IDS sends a whole heap of alerts to administrators and they get tied up processing those, it's much easier for an attacker to slip in amongst that large range of alerts another attack that is actually designed to exploit the target system. Now, sometimes you'll see this referred to as a flooding attack, just flooding the IDS with these alerts. And there have been tools in the past like Stick and Snot designed specifically to cause an IDS to generate all of these alerts. And as I just mentioned, the whole thing can actually make it very hard to identify legitimate attacks because there's so much noise. Now, you may also see this attack referred to as false positive generation. Yes, the IDS is generating alerts. No, they're not alerts for any activity which is genuinely going to exploit a system behind an IDS. Now, as well as tying up administrative resources, generating all of those false positives can actually tie up the intrusion detection system's ability to inspect traffic. Now, this could well lead to a DOS of the actual IDS itself, or if enough traffic is generated, it may also lead to the exhaustion of other resources such as disk capacity. So if enough traffic is sent that's intended just purely to raise alerts on the IDS, and then the disk that it's logging those alerts to fills up, it may not actually be able to then log other events, which could lead to subsequent attacks not being tracked. So in a case like this, it's very much about covering tracks. How can the attacker get their attack past the IDS without it having a persistent record of it? So DOS and resource exhaustion attacks are one other form of evasion. Let's go and have a look at a few more at the TCP level. There are a number of other ways that an attacker can use the TCP stack in order to evade an IDS. And one of those ways is by using invalid RST packets, or the reset command within the TCP stack. Now, an RST packet could be sent in the middle of the three-way TCP handshake if the server rejects the connection or it's unavailable. If an attacker attempts to send a reset packet with an invalid checksum, they may be able to cause the IDS to stop processing the TCP stream because it thinks the connection has ended. That doesn't necessarily mean that the host will stop processing the stream though. And this comes back to the idiosyncrasies between the way an IDS handles connections and a system sitting behind it handles them. Attackers are constantly looking for weaknesses in the security control that allows them to get their payload through to the target host. Another angle is the urgency flag, or URG flag within TCP. And this is usually there to inform the host that there's certain data within a segment of the TCP communication that should be prioritized. However, not all intrusion detection systems have always recognized this flag. And what this means is that an attacker could add garbage before the flag, which the IDS will process and then ignore the packet because it is garbage, but then pass it on to the target host, which does recognize the urgency flag, and it legitimately processes the packet. And of course, after that segment of the communication which is flagged as urgent is the malicious payload. So again, it's an exploitation of a weakness in the IDS which doesn't exist in the target host. The final one at the TCP level is desynchronization. And here an attacker is trying to send fake SYN packets. So this is part of that initial three-way handshake again. Fake SYN packets with an invalid sequence number to to desynchronize the IDS and stop it from monitoring legitimate traffic. But again, all of this is predicated on variances between the way the IDS terminates connections and the way the target host does. It's also reflective of just how many implementations of the TCP stack we have. If it was one uniform implementation, which all implemented the spec in the one consistent fashion, this would be a very different story. But as is often the way, different systems handle particularly edge cases very differently. And that's what this level of evasion attack sets out to exploit. So that's a whole bunch of different ways of evading an IDS. Let's now move on and summarize the module. Let's summarize the module. And one of the first things we kicked off with was looking at how an IDS differs from a firewall. And they do differ. They play quite different roles within the environment. A firewall is very good at simply blocking traffic, and it focuses primarily on keeping traffic out of one particular network segment. An IDS can be quite a bit more sophisticated. It may simply log packets or log events. It may look at behavior behind the firewall. It could be a network-based IDS or a host-based IDS. It could monitor log files. It could monitor registry settings on a machine. It is a complementary device to a firewall. I talked about signatures and anomalous behavior. And of course, signatures are the equivalent of a blacklist. Here is what we know to be bad. And it's a defense that's dependent on an attack pattern actually emerging and possibly being successful in some cases before the defense is created. Unlike the anomaly-based detection, which creates that baseline of what we know to be good traffic, and then it looks for anything that deviates from what we consider normal. But of course, all of these defenses have countermeasures, and this is where we get into evasion. And we looked at evasion by obfuscation. Just simple little things, like Robert Graham's example of moving the first few bytes of that heartbleed test a little bit further into the packet. That entirely circumvented the FBI's snort signature, and it's such a simple little thing to do. So obfuscation was one, and there are other techniques like polymorphic code and ASCII shellcode. But there are also the network stack level of attack, so all the fragmentation attacks, breaking packets down into smaller parts, overlapping them, using different TTLs in order to send malformed data to the IDS, but legitimate attack data all the way through to the host. And then, as we just saw, some of the attacks at the TCP level, invalid RST packets, urgency flag, desynchronization. There are many, many different avenues available to start circumventing the defenses of an IDS. As I also mentioned during this module, both attackers and defenses keep evolving. Many of the risks you see here in this module have appeared in various products, been patched, and then attackers moved on and discovered new exploits. This is the very nature of the information security industry, and inevitably this is a pattern that we'll continue to see play out for many years to come yet. So that's intrusion detection systems. We've got one more module to go, and that's honeypots. Let's go and take a look at that now.